6 hidden signs you've already healed but don't know it. Yet, Carl Jung, you think you're still broken. But what if the silence, the distance, and the peace you feel aren't emptiness? They're proof that you've already healed. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." But what he didn't say is that when the pain ends, you won't even realize you've crossed over. Today, we uncover the 6 signs that you've already healed more than you realize, and your soul is quietly becoming whole again. Part 1. The invisible nature of healing. How? Transformation happens in silence. Healing, in Jungian terms, is rarely a dramatic event. It does not announce itself with noise, clarity, or a single moment of revelation. It is rather a slow and imperceptible unfolding within the depths of the psyche, a silent metamorphosis that the ego can only recognize after the fact. Carl Jung often suggested that true transformation happens when the conscious mind begins to cooperate with the unconscious, when what was hidden, suppressed, or disowned begins to surface and is met not with rejection but with awareness. This invisible process is the essence of individuation, the lifelong journey toward becoming whole. To the untrained eye, individuation might look like stillness, withdrawal, or even regression, but in truth it is an inner realignment. When the psyche has endured chaos, fragmentation, or trauma, the first stages of healing are almost imperceptible because they occur beneath the threshold of consciousness. The soul does not rebuild itself through logic. It reorganizes itself through symbolic movement, dreams, intuition, and the silent reordering of inner structures. What Jung called the self, the organizing principle of the psyche, does not speak in words. It communicates through subtle feelings of relief, through a shift in energy, through the sudden loss of interest in old conflicts. One day you realize that something which used to trigger you no longer has power over you. There is no trumpet of victory, no conscious declaration of healing. There is only quiet neutrality, a space where reaction used to live. This is the first sign of deep transformation. You no longer seek external validation. One of the earliest and clearest signs that you have healed more than you realize is that you stop needing external validation. For much of our early life, we depend on external reflection to confirm our identity. The ego thrives on recognition. It wants to be seen, approved of, and validated by others. Jung described this stage as the dominance of the persona, the mask we wear to function in society. The persona is not evil, it is necessary. Yet when the persona becomes the center of our identity, our sense of worth depends on how others respond to us. Healing begins when the individual withdraws projections from the outer world. You no longer chase approval, likes, or reassurance because you start sensing your intrinsic value from within. This shift is not arrogance, it is alignment. The self begins to provide the validation that the ego once sought from others. The silence of healing is the moment you no longer need to prove anything to anyone. The absence of noise, competition, or comparison becomes a sacred sign of wholeness. When you begin to rest in this self-knowledge, relationships start to change. You stop performing, you start existing. You no longer contort yourself to fit expectations. You recognize that your worth is not a negotiation, but a fact of your being. This inner confidence often feels strange at first, because the ego mistakes peace for emptiness. Yet peace is not emptiness, it is fullness without craving. In Jung's language, this is the movement from the ego toward the self, a reorientation of energy from the outer world to the inner world. The person who has healed begins to live from a deeper axis of consciousness. They are no longer tossed by praise or blame. Their emotional weather stabilizes, and they begin to experience the subtle joy of equilibrium. The ego's silence and the unconscious integration. For Jung, the unconscious was not merely a storehouse of repressed material, but a living system that seeks balance. Every conscious attitude creates its unconscious counterpart. When we are excessively rational, the unconscious compensates with emotion. When we are overly submissive, it compensates with aggression. Healing happens when these opposites are reconciled not by suppression but by integration. At first, this process is invisible because the psyche is working to restore equilibrium at levels far below awareness. Old patterns dissolve quietly. The need to over-explain, to defend, to prove starts to fade. Instead of reacting impulsively, you observe. This observing consciousness is the soul's sign of maturity. In dreams, you may begin to see symbols of rebirth, water, children dawn, or circular mandalas. Jung found that such imagery often appears when the unconscious is reconfiguring itself toward wholeness. You may not understand it consciously, but something inside you begins to trust life again. Trust is a symptom of healing. It is not naive optimism. It is the deep knowing that the self has an inherent direction and that you can allow it to unfold. The ego resists this silence. It wants progress. It can measure milestones. It can celebrate. But the unconscious does not operate on egoic timelines. Its work is cyclical, mysterious, and profoundly organic. Healing often feels like nothing is happening, until suddenly you realize that you no longer identify with your old pain. You remember, but you do not relive. That detachment is grace in psychological form. From reaction to reflection. Before healing, your consciousness is reactive. The world touches your wounds and you explode or collapse. Each encounter feels personal, and every slight cuts deeply. But as integration deepens, the distance between stimulus and response expands. This expansion is sacred. It is the psychic space Jung believed necessary for individuation. You begin to observe the energy of your emotions without fusing with them. You notice anger, sadness, or anxiety arising like weather patterns in the sky of awareness. You no longer mistake the weather for the sky itself. In Jungian psychology, this capacity is a hallmark of consciousness. To see one's inner states without becoming them is to stand in the center of the mandala, the symbol of the self. Healing, therefore, is not about erasing the shadow or suppressing emotion. It is about developing a relationship with them that is grounded in awareness. You become both participant and witness. When you can reflect instead of react, your relationships change profoundly. You no longer demand that others regulate your emotions. You stop assigning them the role of savior or villain. Instead, you begin to meet people from the fullness of your being, not from the emptiness of your needs. This shift is not visible to others, but it is monumental inside. You begin to sense the quiet dignity of being your own center. The dissolution of inner conflict. Another invisible sign of healing is the softening of inner conflict. Jung believed that neurosis often arises when the conscious and unconscious are at war, when one part of the psyche demands what another part forbids. Healing occurs when these opposing forces begin to dialogue. You may still feel tension, but it no longer tears you apart. The energy that was once trapped in contradiction becomes available for creativity. You may notice that you no longer overthink as much as you used to. The mind relaxes because it no longer has to defend against itself. You stop interpreting every silence as rejection, every ending as failure. Instead, you perceive events symbolically. You start asking, what is this experience trying to show me, rather than, why is this happening to me? That small shift from victimhood to meaning marks the birth of wisdom. Carl Jung emphasized that meaning is the antidote to suffering. When pain is framed within a meaningful narrative, it ceases to be purely destructive. Healing, therefore, is not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. You begin to understand that your wounds were teachers, not punishments. They shaped your consciousness, widened your empathy, and initiated your individuation. Silence is the sacred space of transformation. Silence in Jungian psychology is not mere absence of sound. It is a psychic container, a vessel where unconscious contents can rise safely. In stillness, the ego loses its dominance, allowing deeper truths to emerge. This is why so many people experience healing not through conversation, but through solitude, meditation, or creative work. The psyche requires silence to reassemble its fragments. During this stage, others may misinterpret you. They may think you are isolating or withdrawing. But you are not escaping life, you are descending into it. You are visiting the interior of your being, listening to what was once drowned out by noise. Jung called this process active imagination, the conscious engagement with unconscious material. It is not fantasy. It is a dialogue with the soul. In the silence of healing, time slows down. The old compulsions fade. You stop seeking constant stimulation because you no longer fear the emptiness. The absence of noise becomes nourishment. In that stillness, the self whispers softly but clearly that you are no longer who you once were. You do not need to announce your growth. Your presence speaks it. Recognizing the invisible milestones. There are moments in life when you look back and realize you have crossed a threshold. The situations that once paralyzed you no longer have the same weight. The people who once controlled your emotions now evoke neutrality. This neutrality is not indifference, it is liberation. You have recovered the energy that was tied to past conflicts and reintegrated it into the self. Healing, therefore, is not a return to who you were before the wound. It is the emergence of someone more whole, more conscious, more capable of love. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and that becoming is often so quiet, so subtle that only hindsight can reveal it. You may notice that your dreams become gentler. The imagery shifts from chaos to order, from conflict to reconciliation. The inner figures that once terrified you now appear as guides. The unconscious mirrors your progress, symbolically reflecting that the energies once split are now integrated. This is how the psyche celebrates healing, through symbols, not through words. The hidden wisdom of the wound. Jung believed that the wound itself is the place where the light enters. The parts of ourselves that suffer are also the portals of transformation. The ego sees pain as a problem to be fixed. The self sees it as a process to be lived. When you realize that your suffering was never meaningless, you begin to experience gratitude for what once broke you. Gratitude does not erase pain, but it redeems it. This realization often arrives quietly. There is no dramatic aha moment, just a subtle peace. The inner critic grows quieter, the self-blame softens. You begin to relate to your past self with compassion rather than contempt. The inner dialogue transforms from, "Why did I let that happen?" to, "I understand why I did." Compassion for the past self is one of the clearest indicators that healing has occurred. The paradox of healing is that it often feels uneventful. The psyche does not broadcast progress because it values integration over recognition. True transformation is more like the changing of seasons than the lighting of fireworks. You notice it only when the landscape of your inner world feels different, warmer, calmer, more fertile. Living in harmony with the self, as healing deepens, life begins to flow more naturally. You find yourself less entangled in resistance. You accept reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. This acceptance is not resignation, it is alignment. You begin to sense the presence of something larger guiding your life. Jung called it the self, the totality of the psyche that transcends the ego. When the ego serves the self rather than resists it, inner conflict dissolves. You start noticing synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem to affirm your path. These moments are not random. They are the outer reflections of inner alignment. The universe mirrors the state of your psyche. Healing, therefore, is not only an internal event, but a shift in how reality responds to you. You attract situations that resonate with your new vibration because you no longer operate from lack or fear. At this level, your energy becomes magnetic. People feel peace around you because you are no longer projecting chaos. You become a living symbol of integration, a reminder that wholeness is not perfection but balance. Jung described this as the union of opposites, the conjunctio, the sacred marriage between the conscious and unconscious. The healed person carries this union quietly, not as doctrine, but as presence, the hidden power of unnoticeable change. Perhaps the most mysterious aspect of healing is that you often cannot perceive it while it's happening. Only when you encounter the old trigger, the old wound, and respond differently do you realize how far you've come. The absence of reaction is invisible from the outside, but monumental inside. That quiet pause between impulse and awareness is where evolution occurs. You have healed more than you realize the moment you stop fighting yourself. When your inner world ceases to be a battlefield, life begins to mirror your peace. You no longer live from the wounds of the past, but from the wisdom they generated. And this, Jung would say, is the silent victory of individuation, the soul's quiet return to itself. Part 2. The integration of the shadow, accepting the parts you once rejected. Every healing journey, Jung believed, eventually leads into the territory of the shadow, the dark, unacknowledged side of the psyche that holds everything we have, disowned. To heal is not merely to become calm or kind or detached. It is to turn toward the very parts of ourselves that we once exiled. This is why genuine healing often feels like breaking down before breaking through. Before the soul can integrate, it must face the truth of what it has hidden. The shadow, as Jung defined it, contains all the impulses, emotions, desires, and instincts that our conscious self refuses to recognize. It is not evil by nature, it is simply unconscious. Within it lies our anger, jealousy, lust, fear, and greed, but also our creativity, strength, and vitality. The parts of ourselves we call bad are often merely unlived. The shadow is the dark mirror that shows us the fullness of our humanity. To integrate the shadow is to stop running from it. It is to say, this too is me. Healing, therefore, is not purification, it is reconciliation. You realize you are not only light, not only love, not only calmness. You are the totality of existence within one being capable of both destruction and creation. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the work few dare to do because it requires humility, courage, and self-honesty. You can observe your emotions without being controlled by them. Before shadow, integration emotions possess you. You feel rage and you become rage. You feel jealousy and it consumes your thoughts. In Jungian terms, the complex, the emotionally charged cluster of ideas and experiences has seized your ego. The energy of the unconscious erupts into consciousness and you lose perspective. Healing begins the moment you can observe the eruption without collapsing into it. This capacity to witness emotion without identification is not repression. It is the ego's awakening to its true function, to relate consciously to the forces of the unconscious rather than be overrun by them. You start noticing that when anger arises, it is not you who is angry. It is a part of you. You can breathe with it, listen to it, and learn from it. You realize that your emotions are messengers, not masters. In that moment of observation, healing occurs. You reclaim energy that was once trapped in the unconscious. Instead of reacting, you respond. Instead of projecting your anger onto others, you hold it with awareness. You begin to understand what the anger was protecting, perhaps your boundaries, your dignity, or your need for love. The shadow is not trying to destroy you. It is trying to be acknowledged. Jung viewed the integration of emotions as the process of transforming raw instinct into conscious energy. The emotion is not suppressed but refined. Rage becomes assertiveness. Envy becomes inspiration. Fear becomes awareness. When you bring light to the darkness does not disappear, it transforms. This alchemical process, Jung said, mirrors the work of the ancient alchemists who sought to turn lead into gold. The lead of the psyche, its heavy rejected material, becomes spiritual gold through the fire of awareness. You forgive without needing closure. A profound sign of shadow integration is the ability to forgive without demanding closure. Closure, in the psychological sense, is often an egoic desire, the wish for a tidy ending, a clear explanation, a sense of justice. The ego wants control over meaning, but the self operates beyond that polarity. It seeks understanding, not vindication. When you begin to integrate the shadow, you realize that those who hurt you were also operating from their unconscious wounds. Their cruelty or neglect was not always personal, it was the projection of their own unresolved shadow. This realization does not excuse harm, but it releases you from hatred. You begin to see the tragic interconnectedness of human suffering. Forgiveness becomes an act of liberation, not reconciliation. You are no longer bound by the energy of resentment. The wound no longer defines you. You do not forgive because they deserve it. You forgive because your soul does. Jung often said that what you resist not only persists but grows in size. When you stop resisting the past, its hold on you dissolves. That dissolution is healing in its purest form. This kind of forgiveness happens quietly. You may never tell the person who hurt you. You may never even speak it aloud. But inside a knot unties. You stop rehearsing the story of pain and a new story begins, the story of freedom. You sense that you are no longer the same person who was hurt, and therefore the hurt itself has lost relevance. The ego craves closure. The self offers transcendence. The paradox of darkness as medicine. To heal through the shadow is to enter paradox. The very things you once feared become your medicine. The emotion you avoided becomes your teacher. The weakness you hid becomes your strength. Jung saw this as the psyche's way of achieving balance. What is repressed below returns as fate until it is integrated. That is why patterns repeat, why we attract similar relationships, conflicts, or failures. The unconscious demands acknowledgement through repetition. When you finally face the pattern, you stop the cycle. You recognize, this is not bad luck. This is my shadow seeking my attention. In that moment, you shift from being a victim of your unconscious to a collaborator with it. You move from projection to participation. Jung described this as the moral problem of the modern individual, to integrate the shadow consciously rather than project it outward as evil. As long as we deny our aggression, we will meet it in the world as enemies. As long as we repress our desire, it will surface as obsession. The unintegrated shadow ensures that what we refuse to face internally, we will face externally. Healing happens when the boundary between inner and outer dissolves in awareness. To look into your own darkness without judgment is one of the most courageous acts of consciousness. It is not pleasant. The shadow often appears first as shame, disgust, or fear. But once you endure its gaze, you realize that the monster is not a monster, it is a wounded child, a forgotten truth, a lost fragment of soul. When you embrace it, you reclaim the vitality that was buried with it. The alchemy of integration. Jung's psychological alchemy describes 3 key stages of transformation: nigredo blackening, albedo whitening, and rubedo reddening. In the nigredo, you descend into confusion and despair, the dark night of the soul. In the albedo, you begin to purify perception, seeing your pain without distortion. In the rubedo, the opposites unite, and a new consciousness emerges, symbolized by the red of dawn, the rebirth of the self. Shadow integration moves through these alchemical stages. The nigredo feels like loss, chaos, or depression. It is the death of the old ego. Everything familiar dissolves and the psyche appears dark. But this stage is essential. Without it, no true rebirth occurs. The darkness is the womb, not the tomb. In the albedo, awareness expands. You begin to see your patterns with clarity. You take responsibility for your projections. You realize that the people who trigger you are mirrors, not enemies. The soul starts to clean itself through insight. Finally, in the rubedo, you integrate. You no longer divide yourself into good and bad. You become whole, and from that wholeness arises creative energy, wisdom, and compassion. This inner alchemy cannot be rushed. It happens according to the rhythm of the soul, not the ambition of the ego. The true healer within you, the self, knows the timing of transformation. Your task is only to stay present, to witness the process with patience and surrender. When you no longer fear the shadow, another sign you've healed more than you realize is that you no longer fear the darkness within you. You can acknowledge your capacity for anger, envy, or lust without shame. You recognize them as energies, not identities. This maturity liberates you from moral perfectionism. You stop striving to be good and start striving to be real. And paradoxically, in becoming real, you become good in the truest sense, honest, integrated, and whole. When you no longer fear your shadow, you stop fearing others. You see through projection. You understand that everyone carries hidden pain. This insight dissolves judgment and strengthens empathy. You become less reactive to the flaws of others because you have met those same flaws within yourself. Compassion replaces condemnation. In Jung's view, this capacity for empathy marks the emergence of the self. The integrated person becomes a vessel of healing for others simply by being. They radiate wholeness not because they are perfect, but because they are at peace with their imperfections. Their presence feels safe because it carries no unconscious agenda. The shadow has been met, so it no longer needs to be projected. The subtle liberation of self-acceptance. Shadow integration is not dramatic. It happens in subtle moments of self-acceptance. You notice a flaw, and instead of judging it, you smile softly. You recognize a pattern returning, and instead of condemning yourself, you become curious. Curiosity replaces shame. Awareness replaces punishment. This gentle shift is the heartbeat of healing. When you stop waging war against yourself, your inner world becomes peaceful. The psyche no longer wastes energy on suppression. That freed energy flows into creativity, intuition, and love. Many people mistake the stillness that follows integration for emptiness, but it is fullness, life returning to its rightful owner. This is why Jung said that the shadow, when it is realized, is the seat of creativity. The energy once locked in repression becomes the very force that drives art, insight, and transformation. You find yourself expressing rather than suppressing. You speak truths that once terrified you. You create beauty from the very material of your pain. Healing in this sense is not the removal of darkness, but its transmutation. You do not conquer the shadow, you dance with it. You learn its rhythm, respect its wisdom, and allow it to contribute to your wholeness. The more you accept your own complexity, the more you move toward inner unity. The fragmented psyche becomes a symphony, wholeness over purity. Perhaps the greatest illusion of the spiritual or psychological path is that healing equals purity. Jung dismantled this myth. He reminded us that the goal of life is not to be pure, but to be whole. Purity divides the psyche into acceptable and unacceptable parts, perpetuating inner conflict. Wholeness, on the other hand, embraces contradiction. It allows light and darkness to coexist without hostility. When you realize you are capable of both harm and healing, you become responsible. Responsibility means the ability to respond consciously. You no longer act from compulsion. You choose. This freedom is the essence of individuation. The individual who has integrated the shadow is no longer ruled by fate because they have absorbed what fate once represented, the unowned parts of themselves. Wholeness brings humility. You stop preaching goodness and start practicing presence. You see that everyone, including you, carries both saint and sinner. The arrogance of moral superiority dissolves. You begin to meet life as it is, not as an ideal. And in that acceptance you find the sacred middle path that Jung called the transcendent function, the bridge between opposites. Healing as the union of opposites. The psyche, Jung said, seeks balance between the opposites, light and dark, masculine and feminine reason, and feeling, spirit and matter. The shadow represents everything that was excluded from our conscious identity. Integration is the marriage of these opposites. When the opposites unite, the energy that once fueled inner conflict becomes the energy of consciousness itself. You begin to feel a new kind of peace, not the fragile peace of avoidance, but the grounded peace of integration. You are no longer pulled apart by extremes. You can feel deep emotion without drowning in it. You can hold both joy and sorrow without needing to escape either. This is not emotional numbness, it is emotional mastery. The union of opposites is symbolized in many cultures, yin and yang, day and night, life and death. Jung saw in these archetypes the universal story of transformation. Healing, then, is the realization that you are both the darkness and the dawn. You stop identifying with one pole and recognize yourself as the whole cycle. When this union occurs, a quiet authority emerges. You no longer speak from wounds, you speak from wisdom. Your presence carries a subtle gravity. You become, as Jung described, a vessel of the divine, because the divine is nothing other than the totality made conscious. Part 3. the detachment from old identities, ego death, and renewal. In every genuine process of transformation, there comes a point when the old self begins to dissolve. This dissolution is terrifying for the ego but liberating for the soul. Carl Jung called it the death of the ego, not in the physical sense, but as the symbolic death of all the identities we once believed ourselves to be. When you have healed more than you realize, it is often because you have already begun to detach from the roles, masks, and illusions that no longer serve your evolution. Ego death does not happen through conscious decision alone. It unfolds naturally as a result of inner growth. When the psyche expands, the old structures of meaning cannot contain it. The person you once were begins to feel distant, almost foreign. You start to see your own story as if watching it from outside. The emotions that once defined you lose their power. The labels victim, savior, perfectionist, empath, achiever begin to dissolve like mist under sunlight. This can feel disorienting at first. You may even feel like you are losing yourself. But in Jungian psychology, this loss is not a failure, it is initiation. The ego must die in order for the self to live more fully. Just as the caterpillar cannot imagine the flight of the butterfly, the ego cannot imagine life beyond its limitations, yet that is precisely where the healing leads. The collapse of the old story. Every ego is built on a narrative, a coherent story of who we think we are. It begins in childhood, shaped by the projections of parents, culture, and collective ideals. We spend years reinforcing this story, the responsible one, the strong one, the misunderstood one, the successful one. These roles give us stability but also imprison us. They become defenses against the chaos of the unknown. When healing deepens, the story collapses. You stop identifying with the script that once defined you. The desire to prove, defend, or maintain the image fades. You begin to sense that your life is not a fixed story but a living mystery. The ego resists this revelation because it fears irrelevance. It whispers, "Who will I be if I'm not this?" And yet beneath that fear, a profound peace begins to grow, a peace born of surrender. Jung saw this as the natural progression of individuation. The more the ego aligns with the self, the less it needs to control. The collapse of the old narrative is not an annihilation, but a return to authenticity. You begin to live spontaneously, not performatively. You no longer seek meaning from identity. You draw it directly from being. This is the silent renewal that few recognize as healing. Outwardly, nothing may change. You still go to work, meet friends, live your life. But inwardly, a fundamental shift has occurred. Your center of gravity has moved from ego to essence. You feel peace in solitude. One of the clearest signs that the old self is dissolving is a newfound comfort in solitude. The ego depends on constant reflection from the outer world. It needs interaction to confirm its existence. But the self is nourished in stillness. When you no longer feel the compulsion to fill silence, to chase validation, or to escape your own company, it means your consciousness has matured. This peace in solitude is not isolation, it is communion. You begin to feel connected to everything without needing anyone. The noise of the world recedes, and your inner voice becomes audible again. Jung described this as introversion of libido, the turning inward of psychic energy. Instead of projecting outward, your life force begins to circulate within, healing and strengthening your inner system. People often mistake this stage for loneliness, but loneliness belongs to the ego, the part of you that feels incomplete without others. Solitude, on the other hand, belongs to the soul. It is not absence but presence. When you can sit in stillness without reaching for distraction, it means you have touched your own depth. You no longer fear emptiness because you have discovered what fills it, awareness itself. In solitude, the new self begins to form. It grows quietly, without audience, without applause. You start to notice that your thoughts become gentler, your body lighter, your emotions less reactive. The silence that once felt uncomfortable now feels sacred. You are no longer escaping life. You are entering it more deeply. The disintegration of attachment healing often reveals how much of our suffering came from attachment to people, outcomes, or identities. The ego clings to familiarity because it equates stability with survival. But healing introduces fluidity. You begin to release the need to control, to predict, to hold on. Things that once seemed essential, certain relationships, goals, opinions, start to lose their grip. You might notice that you stop chasing people who no longer match your vibration. You no longer need to convince anyone of your worth. You stop replaying old arguments in your mind. The compulsion to fix everything begins to dissolve. This is not apathy, it is wisdom. You are learning to trust the natural rhythm of endings and beginnings. In Jung's view, detachment is not indifference. It is the realization that all forms are transient expressions of a deeper unity. You stop confusing the temporary for the eternal. Love becomes freer, less possessive. Success becomes simpler, less defining. The ego fears this detachment because it cannot thrive without attachment, but the soul rejoices. It recognizes this, letting go as a return to flow. When the past loses its power, perhaps the most profound sign of ego death is when the past no longer has the power to define you. You still remember, but the memory no longer carries emotional charge. It becomes information, not identification. Jung described this as the withdrawal of projection from the past. The psyche stops feeding old wounds with psychic energy, and they begin to close naturally. You realize that you can look at your history without reliving it. The trauma that once shaped you becomes wisdom. The relationships that once broke you become teachers. You begin to feel gratitude for the very experiences that once caused pain, because you can now see how they forged your awareness. This is the moment when time itself feels different. The psychological clock slows down. You no longer live in a loop of anticipation and regret. You inhabit the present more fully because the ego, whose nature is always to look backward or forward, has loosened its grip. The self lives only in the now. The death that births you, ego death, feels like chaos because the structures of meaning are collapsing. Yet Jung insisted that this collapse is not destruction but transformation. The old ego must die for a new orientation of consciousness to emerge. This death can appear as depression, confusion, or emptiness. Many mistake it for failure, but it is the sacred space between identities, the chrysalis between caterpillar and butterfly. In mythology, this phase is symbolized by descent, Christ's 3 days in the tomb, Persephone's journey to the underworld, or the alchemist's nigredo. It is a necessary passage. When everything you once believed about yourself disintegrates, the psyche creates room for something greater to arise. The self cannot be born into a crowded house. The ego must first make space. You may find yourself losing interest in things that once excited you. The ambitions of the old self feel hollow. You may feel called to simplicity, authenticity, or silence. Others may misinterpret this as withdrawal or loss of drive, but it is renewal in disguise. The soul is reorienting its compass from external achievement to internal alignment. What dies is the illusion of control. What is born is trust. Rebirth through awareness. Rebirth is not dramatic. It arrives like dawn, slowly, quietly, inevitably. One morning you wake up and feel lighter. You no longer carry the same resentment, the same fear. The air around you seems clearer. The self has begun to take the place of the old ego. Jung saw this as the culmination of individuation, the point at which consciousness expands enough to embrace the totality of being. This new self does not reject the ego but integrates it. The ego becomes the instrument rather than the master. You begin to act from awareness rather than compulsion. Decisions flow naturally, relationships feel balanced, creativity returns. You sense a subtle connection to life that does not depend on control. You are guided rather than driven. Jung often spoke of the mandala of the self, a symbol of perfect balance where every part of the psyche has its rightful place. After ego death, the mandala begins to form within you. The opposites that once divided you, strength and vulnerability, logic and emotion control, and surrender, find harmony. You are no longer fragmented. The self has become the organizing principle of your existence. Freedom from the illusion of control. The healed individual no longer seeks to dominate life. The ego's addiction to control has dissolved in the face of trust. You begin to understand that your role is not to manipulate reality but to align with it. This is the essence of psychological freedom, the ability to move with life's current instead of fighting it. This freedom does not make you passive. On the contrary, it empowers authentic action. You act without anxiety, love without fear, speak without pretense. You are no longer trying to be someone. You simply are. This is the quiet authority that arises from ego death, the confidence that needs no audience. Jung described this state as the reconciliation between the human and the divine within the psyche. When the ego bows to the self, it becomes an instrument of the soul's expression. Life begins to feel orchestrated rather than chaotic. Synchronicities appear not as coincidences but as confirmations that you are aligned with your deeper purpose. You stop repeating toxic patterns. Before the death of the old ego, you repeat the same emotional scripts over and over, chasing love through suffering, seeking validation through sacrifice, finding identity in pain. These loops are not punishment. They are unconscious attempts at integration. The psyche keeps recreating what it has not yet understood. After ego death, the repetition stops. You see the pattern clearly, and clarity itself dissolves it. You realize that you no longer resonate with the vibration of pain. The situations that once trapped you no longer attract you. You can walk away without resentment, choose peace without guilt, and set boundaries without fear. This is one of the most tangible signs of inner renewal. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The end of repetition means you have made something conscious. You have brought light into the dark corners of your psyche. What once felt like fate becomes choice, and that choice is freedom. The quiet confidence of renewal. After the old identity dies, there is often a phase of stillness, a sacred pause before the new life begins. You may feel emptiness, but this emptiness is fertile. It is the silence before creation. In this stillness, you begin to sense a quiet confidence emerging, not based on egoic self-esteem, but on existential trust. You no longer need to know what's next because you have faith in your own becoming. The people around you may not notice anything extraordinary, but inside your consciousness has expanded. You respond differently to life. Where you once reacted, you now reflect. Where you once clung, you now release. Where you once sought, you now attract. This subtle transformation marks the rebirth of your being. In Jung's symbolic language, you have crossed from the first half of life dominated by ambition and identity into the second half of life guided by meaning and essence. The outer life continues, but its purpose changes from building an image to embodying truth. You no longer need to seek the light outside because you have found it within. Living from the self. The final stage of renewal is living from the self. This is not a mystical fantasy, but a psychological reality. The self is not separate from you, it is the totality of you. When the ego surrenders its throne, the self takes its rightful place as the center of consciousness. Decisions arise from intuition rather than fear. Relationships become mirrors of wholeness rather than projections of lack. You begin to see life symbolically. Every event, pleasant or painful, becomes part of your individuation process. You are no longer at war with reality because you understand its purpose. The outer world and inner world move in harmony. This alignment is the fruit of ego death, the rebirth of the soul into conscious existence. In this new state, you realize that healing was never about becoming perfect. It was about remembering who you were before you believed you were broken. The death of the ego reveals what was always there, the vast luminous awareness that is your true nature. And in that realization, you are reborn not as someone new, but as the one who has always been. Part 4. Living from the Self, the emergence of the authentic soul. When the process of healing matures, a profound transformation occurs within the psyche. the center of life shifts from the ego to the self. This shift is so subtle and yet so revolutionary that it redefines what it means to exist. You no longer live to defend your identity or fulfill external expectations. Instead, you begin to move in harmony with an inner intelligence that feels ancient, compassionate, and quietly powerful. Carl Jung described the self as the totality of the psyche, the unification of the conscious and the unconscious, the bridge between the human and the divine. Living from the self does not mean transcending humanity. It means embodying it fully. It means living as a soul that has remembered its wholeness. When you reach this stage, you realize that healing was never about becoming flawless, but about becoming real. You start creating instead of reacting. Before integration, life feels like a sequence of reactions. The world acts and you respond, often defensively, unconsciously, emotionally. Every event becomes a trigger that pulls you into familiar patterns. But once the self emerges as the inner center, you stop reacting and begin creating. This is not about productivity or artistic output. It is about living creatively, that is, with consciousness, freedom, and intention. Jung wrote, "The creative mind plays with the objects it loves." When you heal, your relationship with life becomes play, not struggle. You begin to shape your reality instead of being shaped by it. You respond to conflict with awareness, to endings with acceptance, to beginnings with curiosity. You no longer need to control outcomes because you trust your own alignment. This shift from reaction to creation marks a deep psychological maturity. You have reclaimed your psychic energy from the unconscious and now direct it, consciously shaping your inner and outer world in alignment with your soul's purpose. The creative impulse that arises from the self is sacred. It is not driven by ambition or fear, but by participation in the unfolding of life. You no longer act to prove something. You act because expression is your nature. This creativity might manifest as art, love, kindness, clarity, or presence. The form doesn't matter. The consciousness behind it does. The emergence of inner authority living from the self brings with it a new kind of authority, one that does not need validation. You begin to trust your intuition, not as a fleeting feeling, but as an expression of inner knowing. Jung believed that intuition is the language of the self. It arises from the deep intelligence of the unconscious, which perceives patterns that the rational mind cannot. This inner authority feels different from egoic confidence. The ego says, "I know." The self says, "I understand." The ego argues. The self listens. The ego wants to be right. The self wants to be whole. When you live from the self, decisions no longer come from anxiety or social conditioning. They come from a deep resonance, a quiet yes or no that you can feel in your entire being. People may not always understand your choices. Some may even accuse you of changing or becoming distant. But you are not distancing, you are aligning. The authentic soul does not conform, it harmonizes. Your life begins to feel guided rather than managed, orchestrated rather than controlled. Synchronicities become frequent, meaningful coincidences that confirm your alignment with the deeper order of reality. This is how the self communicates, not through logic, but through meaning. Jung called these moments causal connections, evidence that the psyche and the cosmos are intertwined. The universe mirrors the state of your inner being, and life becomes an ongoing dialogue between the visible and the invisible. The light of awareness and the shadow of humility. To live from the self is to live in balance between the light of awareness and the shadow of humility. The healed person knows that wholeness does not erase imperfection. The shadow remains, but it no longer dominates. You can acknowledge your flaws without shame, your emotions without suppression, your humanity without guilt. Jung often warned that inflation, the identification of the ego with the self, is one of the greatest dangers of spiritual growth. When the ego mistakes itself for the self, it becomes grandiose, claiming divine insight without embodying it. True wholeness, however, is humble. It recognizes that the self is both within and beyond the individual. You are the vessel, not the source. Humility becomes natural when you have seen the vastness of the unconscious. You realize how little the conscious mind truly controls. The self operates on a level that transcends personal will. To live from it is to cooperate, not command. You learn to listen deeply to dreams, symbols, sensations, and coincidences because they reveal what the self is communicating. In this humility there is immense strength. You are no longer driven by pride, fear, or comparison. You stand calmly in the storm because your foundation is internal. The ego seeks stability in status. The self finds stability in truth, peace amid chaos. One of the most unmistakable signs that you are living from the self is your ability to remain centered amid external chaos. The world may still be unpredictable. People may still act unconsciously. Challenges may still arise, but something within you remains unmoved. This is not denial, it is alignment. You begin to see that peace is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of consciousness. The healed soul does not need perfect conditions to be calm because it no longer depends on externals for balance. The source of equilibrium has shifted inward. Jung compared this to the still point at the center of the mandala, the symbolic representation of the self. No matter how the outer circles spin, the center remains still. When you live from that center, life ceases to feel like a battle. You stop being at war with what is. Suffering transforms into insight and resistance becomes flow. You understand that everything, even pain, serves your individuation. You do not need to understand every detail. You trust the process. This is the faith that arises not from belief, but from experience. You have seen the pattern enough times to know that even darkness leads to light. Relationships as mirrors of wholeness. As you live from the self, your relationships change profoundly. You no longer relate to others from need, but from presence. You do not enter relationships to fill a void, but to share fullness. The old dynamic of dependency and projection dissolves. You stop seeking saviors because you have integrated your own inner opposites, the masculine and the feminine, the light and the shadow, the conscious and the unconscious. This inner marriage, which Jung called the conjunctio, is one of the central symbols of wholeness. When your inner masculine, active, decisive energy and feminine, receptive, intuitive energy are balanced, your outer relationships reflect that harmony. You no longer project your unhealed aspects onto others. You stop trying to fix people or be fixed by them. Love becomes freedom, not attachment. This kind of relationship feels spacious. You can allow others to be who they are without needing to change them. You can disagree without hostility, separate without hatred, and connect without fear. The self loves not out of lack, but out of abundance. Its love is not conditional, but essential, a natural outflow of wholeness. Meaning as the new compass. For the ego, life revolves around goals, success, and control. For the self, life revolves around meaning. Jung said that the lack of meaning in life is the chief source of modern suffering. When you live from the self, meaning becomes your compass. You no longer make choices based on fear or social expectation. You choose what resonates with your inner truth. This does not mean every moment is blissful. Meaning often includes suffering. But the difference is that suffering now feels purposeful. You sense that every challenge carries a lesson, every loss, a revelation. You begin to perceive life symbolically, not literally. A failed relationship becomes an initiation in love. A setback becomes a redirection toward authenticity. You no longer ask why me, but what is this showing me, meaning transforms endurance into participation. Instead of enduring life, you begin to dance with it. You no longer try to escape the mystery, you explore it. The self thrives on mystery, because it knows that not everything needs to be understood, only experienced consciously. Living from meaning also frees you from comparison. You understand that your path is unique, that your story unfolds in divine timing. You stop measuring yourself against others because you no longer need external markers of progress. The only question that matters is, am I aligned with my truth right now? compassion as the expression of wholeness. When the self governs consciousness, compassion arises naturally. You no longer judge the wounded because you have been wounded. You no longer despise the ignorant because you have known ignorance. The boundaries between self and other blur, not in codependence but in empathy. You see humanity as one vast psyche, each person mirroring aspects of the collective unconscious. This compassion does not make you naive, it makes you wise. You can love without losing discernment, forgive without losing boundaries, and help without losing yourself. Compassion rooted in the self is clear, not sentimental. It recognizes that every person is on their own path of individuation, and forcing them to change before they are ready would violate their process. Thus you love through understanding, not through rescuing. You no longer need to fix others to feel valuable. You radiate presence instead of advice. People around you may feel healed simply by being near you, not because of what you say, but because your energy communicates safety. The self heals by resonance. Its wholeness awakens wholeness in others. The soul's quiet joy. There is a kind of joy that arises when you live from the self. Not excitement, not euphoria, but quiet joy. It is the feeling of being at home in yourself. The search ends not because you found all the answers, but because you no longer need them. The questions themselves become sacred. This joy is not dependent on circumstance. It coexists with sorrow, with impermanence, with the bittersweet flow of existence. Jung called this state amor fati, the love of one's fate. To live from the self is to love what is not, because it is easy, but because it is real. You understand that everything that has ever happened was necessary to bring you to this point of awareness. You begin to live with gratitude, not the performative gratitude of forced positivity, but the quiet gratitude of recognition. Every breath, every encounter, every emotion becomes a moment of communion with life itself. You realize that the sacred was never somewhere else. It was always here within you, waiting to be seen. The self as the bridge between heaven and earth. At its deepest level, living from the self is living as the bridge between spirit and matter, heaven and earth, consciousness and form. You embody the paradox of being both infinite and finite, both human and divine. The self does not reject the physical world, it sanctifies it. Every act, no matter how ordinary, becomes an expression of the sacred when done with awareness. Jung believed that the individuation process is the way the divine becomes conscious through the human being. Each person who awakens to the self contributes to the evolution of collective consciousness. The more you live from your center, the more harmony you bring into the world, not through preaching but through presence. This is the highest form of healing, not to escape the world, but to participate in it consciously. You no longer see life as a test to survive, but as an art to live. You are not seeking enlightenment. You are embodying it in every gesture, every word, every silence. You are the light you were seeking. At the end of this journey, the realization dawns with simplicity. You are what you were looking for. The healer, the teacher, the savior, all were reflections pointing back to you. The self that now lives through you is not new. It was always there, hidden beneath the noise of the ego's fears and ambitions. You have not become someone else. You have remembered yourself. You have healed not by addition but by subtraction, by removing everything that was never truly you. What remains is authenticity, awareness, and love. This realization does not make you superior. It makes you serene. You no longer need to prove or persuade. Your existence itself becomes your message. You walk through the world, quietly radiant, carrying within you the equilibrium of the self, that unshakable stillness at the center of the storm. And in that stillness, you finally understand what healing really means. It was never about returning to who you were before the pain. It was about becoming who you truly are, the authentic soul living from the wholeness of the self. Healing was never a return to who you were before the storm. It was the discovery of who you were always meant to become. You've outgrown the pain, the fear, and the person who once needed to be saved. Now you are the calm within the chaos, the self that Carl Jung spoke of, awake, aware, and free. If this spoke to your soul, remember, healing doesn't make noise, it makes light.